Learn the most advanced recruiting techniques. Land the most desirable talent. Launch your company towards massive success. This is the Higher Power Radio Show with Rick Girard.
Structure your interview for success. Plan, prepare, and execute a process that gets to the truth of who the person is across the table from you. I'm Rick Girard, and welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show. Our mission is to discuss and deconstruct insights from top-performing entrepreneurs and industry experts. Every week, we uncover tested tactical solutions to solve your company's toughest hiring challenges. Today, our guest is Scott Kuethen. Scott is the CEO of Amtec, a professional recruiting organization specializing in placing professionals in contract and full-time roles with companies ranging from small entrepreneurial startups to Fortune 100. Scott is also an avid teacher and writer in various areas of talent acquisition and selection, organizational planning, and business management. His life purpose is helping people find meaning in their work. In his spare time, he enjoys photography, scuba diving, and swimming, and other various activities that keep him young-minded. Scott, welcome to the Higher Power Radio Show today.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Great to have you. So you and I being kindred spirits, since we both kind of have similar views on how we approach search, I was really excited to have you on the show today.
Great to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to cover interviewing. So I want to cover, we both have kind of two unique ideas on how we structure interviews, and I wanted to cover what a proper interview structure should look like, and then preparing and planning for the interview, and then how to execute an outstanding interview process. So we got
Fabulous.
a lot to cover. So let's start with the foundation. So how should an interview be structured?
So I might first start by saying that too often when we debrief with a client after they've gone through an interview, we learn, and a candidate, we learn that that there was no preparation on the part of the hiring manager.
Yep.
And so we learned that there were no questions prepared ahead of time, and the hiring manager does all the talking, and when that happens, not much is learned.
Yeah.
And so then a hiring decision is made with poor information, and that's never a good basis for a hiring decision.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. And I think this goes all the way back to just even starting the process in the job description, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
If you've got a poor job description, you don't take the time to set up the foundation, you're gonna fail.
And in fact, great point. That position profile, that job description, in my view, that job description should identify the core competencies that are required for success.
Mm-hmm.
And if it does, then we can build interview questions that probe those core competencies.
Absolutely.
And so I would say part of that preparation would be to build behavioral interview questions that are focused on those core competencies. That would be part of what I would do for the interview preparation and the interview structure.
Well, yeah, and having some sort of structure rather than just a random, hey, I'm going to talk to you, and then we may have John who might be able to join us, and it's very haphazardly put together as opposed to, okay, here's your schedule, here's it's gonna look like.
Absolutely.
So unimpressive.
Yeah, and so when I am involved in interviewing, and I still am tangled up with high-level search projects where I'm personally involved on behalf of the client. So when that happens, I actually have an interview plan where I've got a schedule, and I know how. It's almost like a script.
Yeah.
In fact, it is a script. I have a beginning, an intro. We can talk about that if you'd like, but an intro where I set the stage. I walk the candidate through what to expect, then and then we go step by step through that whole interview process.
Sure.
And then we begin.
Yeah.
And same thing. Then when I go on site and facilitate the interview with the candidate and the client, we have a whole interview plan.
Yeah.
And so there's no surprises.
So you're organized.
Yes.
And now, do you time out the process? I mean, that's one of the things that I'm a big proponent of. Okay, you've got 30 minutes, and here's what you're going to cover. You're going to talk to these people. It's scheduled. You're taking the person from here to here to here to here.
Yep.
And and then you're wrapping up properly at the end, right?
Right.
So
I like no surprises.
Yeah.
The candidates like no surprises.
Yeah.
The clients, the hiring manager, they usually like no surprises. Right.
Absolutely.
And I think it lowers stress.
The anxiety.
Yeah.
Especially on the candidate side.
Right.
You
And I really think that whatever we can do to lower anxiety brings out the normal behavior in a candidate, and that helps in decision making all the way around.
All right, so let's talk about prepositions. Prepositions, yeah, I meant preparation. Hopefully I don't say preparation H, but so let's talk about preparation, because that's really an important piece, right? Prepping the candidate for what's exactly going to happen in the manager. So let's pre-planning questions, right? So let's talk about your process that you walk them through for preparation.
Walk a candidate through?
Yeah, let's start with candidate and let's do the company, because I think it's important both sides.
So here's what I do when I sit with a candidate. So first of all, when I interview a candidate to even determine whether they're a suitable candidate for the client,
Sure.
I begin by telling the candidate this. First, I tell the candidate when I first sit down with them, I thank them for coming in, and I do everything that I can to unload their anxiety.
Sure.
I start by saying, look, thanks for coming in. I want you to look at this more like a conversation and less like an interview. And I actually take my hands like I'm holding a basketball, and I say, so let's take the idea of an interview and let's set that aside. We're just going to have a conversation today. And most of the time, I see a sigh of relief come across their face. Now, I don't know the difference between a conversation and an interview, but mostly I see candidates just relax. And I think that's what we want to do.
Absolutely. You want to get rid of that anxiety.
Yeah. So then the next thing I tell them is, I say, listen, the worst thing that could happen is we go through this long process, and the worst thing that can happen is you get the job offer, you like the job offer, you take the job offer, and 6 months down the road, you open your eyes on a Monday morning at 5:30 in the morning, and you think the first thought in your mind is, oh no, what have I done? And I said, we don't want that to happen.
Yeah.
So the only way we can
That's
avoid
way beyond buyer's remorse.
Right. Yeah. It's like you don't want that on your resume.
Yeah.
So if this job doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for anybody. So I know you want to put your best foot forward, but we have to be real here about what's best for you and your career. So let's take an honest look about what is good for you and your career.
Okay. Now let's shift it over to the company side.
Yeah.
So how we prep the companies, because I think this is where we need a lot more help, especially companies. I think they wing it.
Yeah. So first of all, as you said earlier, we really hone in on what they're looking for. So, in fact, we're going through this internally. We're hiring in our shop.
Sure.
And before we see candidate one, we define what we're looking for.
Sure.
Right? So what are the qualities? What are the attributes? What is the performance in their past positions that we expect to find in the candidate that we're looking for? So what have they accomplished? What do we expect them to bring with them to our position, right?
Sure.
So
the impact that they've made.
Yeah.
And how that's going to transfer over.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then so we put that in writing. And then we'll develop, as I said, interview questions around that. Mm-hmm. So behavioral interview questions. Now we happen to have a tool that is online that is free to everybody. In fact, we have lots of big companies use this tool. It's just easily searchable. It's a behavioral interview guide that can be created. So
wait, don't give that up yet, because we're talking about it on the back end of the show.
Okay.
Let's talk about let's focus on the preparation.
Okay. So it's a way to create an interview guide, but I'll just say that.
Okay.
So you can create behavioral interview questions, and it's creating an interview guide,
plan,
right? An interview plan,
yeah,
right?
Okay,
So there's some interview guide questions. So then you've got in that structure, right? So you've got an intro, you've got a plan for what is going to happen in that interview. You may have in that structure, so a beginning, middle, end. Maybe there's a facility tour. There are other players involved.
Sure.
So you script that out, right?
Got it.
If you're using behavioral interview questions, I always like to tell the candidate in advance, listen, I've got scripted interview questions. So we're going to read from a page. And don't let that bother you. We're just asking the same questions of all candidates. So some people are uncomfortable with that.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
I just think it's, just get used to saying
some
that.
interviews are uncomfortable with that too. I mean, I don't want to read questions.
Right.
Yeah.
But, either get used to saying it or memorize the questions because you've used them so frequently.
Yeah.
Right.
Otherwise, it's going to be, so where do you want to be in 5 years? Let
Right.
me tell you more about me.
Right. Or another question that people love to ask, or way in which people love to ask questions is, well, what would you do if? It's the hypothetical question.
Yeah.
And I like to say you ask hypothetical questions and you get hypothetical answers. They're not really meaningful.
Yeah.
Tie that to real work. And, then it's maybe meaniful. But
yeah, tell me about a difficult situation you had, how you handled it.
Right,
Then what'd you do?
Yes.
I find that a lot of people have a hard time digging deeper and making the connection.
Yeah,
okay,
tell me
well,
more about that.
Yeah, and then, okay, did you think about maybe this way?
Right.
Why didn't you approach it, did you think of any other approaches?
Yeah. How did that turn out?
Yeah.
Tell me more about that. Right.
Exactly.
And those behavioral interview questions have a tendency to lead to more and more information, things that we never thought of asking, right? And so more comes out and you learn more. In fact, I usually go in with 10 solid behavioral interview questions, and you just gain so much information that you never even imagine asking in that, right?
You willing to share a few of those in the second half of the show?
Sure.
All right, cool. You brought them with you?
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. So we're talking to Scott Kuethen, the CEO of Amtec. We need to take a quick break, but when we come back, we're going to talk a little bit more about how to execute an interview. We'll be right back.
When you use the Premier Rewards Gold Card from American Express, the rewards points can keep on multiplying. Buy 3 with triple points on airfare. Buy 2 with double points on gas and groceries. And a single point for pretty much every other dollar you spend on the card. Then, start choosing from over 1 million rewards to redeem all those points. Apply today and the annual fee for the first year is on us. Call 1-800-AXP-GOLD or visit axpgold.com. The annual fee for the card is $175. See terms, conditions, and restrictions at axpgold.com.
You're listening to Higher Power with Rick Girard, giving you access to recruiting techniques that will help you hire key talent to build your company towards real success. Rick is a recruiting executive and entrepreneur who's been successfully recruiting in the aggressive Silicon Valley technology landscape for the past 2 decades. After a very successful stint at Apogee, he founded Stride Search in 2012. Based on a lean efficiency model, Stride has uniquely positioned itself as a leader in retained search for the most critical talent hires. With Rick Girard.
And we're back. All right, welcome back to the Higher Power Radio Show. I'm your host, Rick Girard, and our guest today is Scott Kuethen, CEO of Amtec. So we just discussed preparation and planning, and now we're going to explore how to conduct a really strong interview. So Scott's been nice enough to, since I coerced him to go through some of his behavioral questions, we're going to actually walk you through what a good interview process should look like, right?
Yeah.
So let's start with point A. I mean, you get the person in. I think each interviewer should alleviate that anxiety, you know, and we should coach our hiring managers and whoever's on the interview panel to do that.
Yeah. So one of the things that I like to do is, I will tell the candidate, listen, we've got a lot of questions for you today, and especially if it's a candidate that's within my industry,
sure,
I will tell them, look, we don't want you to give up any proprietary information. So if we ask a question today that you feel is asking you to give up any proprietary information. We don't want you to answer.
Sure.
So I like to do that up front, just so that
Absolutely.
a candidate doesn't feel like we're putting them in an awkward position. So that's just a courtesy,
Well,
right?
you also had a very good opener you brought up earlier, in which is something I do, right? You know, hey, what I'll say is, hey, I've interviewed in the past, and I hate the formal interview process. And the fact is, let's just throw that format out the window and let's just have a conversation.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a great stress reliever.
Yeah.
You'll find that the chest will rise and then fall, and then they'll sit back in their seat and go, okay, that's a great idea.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I hate formal interviews too.
People are really grateful for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I also, in the prep before the candidate arrives, when I'm prepping the candidate, I tell them ahead of time. I say, listen, you're going to go into this interview, and we're going to have some questions that are pre-scripted.
Yep.
I'm going to give you an example of the question, just so you know that there's nothing tricky about these questions.
Sure.
And then I give them a typical example, and I tell them, here's an example. Tell us about a time when you and a boss had a conflict. And, I just pick that. It's an easy one for me to remember. And then I go on to tell them a great answer is you think about it, and you tell us of a specific time when you and a boss had a conflict. So you think, and your answer includes, well, I was working at ABC company, and the issue was, and you tell us the issue, and then you go on to tell us about how the thing played out, and there will be some more conversation about it.
Yeah.
And then here's what a poor answer would be, and you tell us, if I had a conflict with my boss, here's how I think I might handle that. That would be a poor answer.
Sure.
And so that's how I prepare them.
Yeah.
And so then
so
they know.
You cut out the hypotheticals.
Right.
Yeah, you
Now,
want
I do
a
my
real
best.
life situation.
Now, in spite of that, I've
Yeah.
had candidates come in spite of that preparation, and do exactly the thing that I've asked them not to do.
Sure.
Right. And
It's on them then.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right. So with that said, I can give you an example of behavioral interview questions, but behavioral interview questions always are open-ended, so we don't ask candidates we don't ask candidates questions that have a right or wrong answer, an apparent right or wrong answer.
Yeah.
We always ask them to tell us a story about their history, something in their work past that enlightens us about how they might have already behaved, and that gives us some insight into how they're likely to behave in our work environment.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So that just it just informs us. It doesn't judge whether they're good, bad, right, or wrong. It just informs us.
And
right?
if you keep it conversational, then it flows.
And I also tell candidates, especially when I'm there to facilitate, I tell candidates that they have every right. In fact, we expect them to ask questions as well along the way. So I tell them, if we ask a question about their conflict with a boss, they might then turn around and ask a question, well, gee, you're asking questions about boss conflicts. Do you have boss conflicts here?
Yeah.
And I say, well, that's fair. And I tell them, I promise, if I'm there to facilitate this, I will not allow them to squirm around that question. I'll make sure that they answer.
Yeah,
So,
absolutely.
I think that's only fair.
Yeah, because everybody's got to know what they're getting themselves into.
Right.
It is a two-way street, and you're interviewing a candidate to get to the truth of who that person is, and you should give that candidate an accurate picture of exactly what the company is.
Right. It brings me into another point.
Yeah.
Part of the structure of the interview is I always like the hiring entity to have a scorecard for the candidate.
Okay.
So we talk in advance about the qualities or attributes that they're looking for. Now,
how are those defined? Those qualities or attributes?
So that may be competencies.
Okay.
If it's a leadership position, that might include things like command presence. It might be leadership skills, business acumen. I'd say 10 to 12 qualities or attributes.
Okay.
Could be competencies. Could be energy or drive or focus.
And those things are things that are important to the company, that
Yes.
are maybe part of the values and that sort of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
And as soon as that interview is completed, and we can gather together the same day, like right after that interview is done, we walk the candidate out, thank them, and then gather right back together. I like that scorecard to be completed. And if there is more than one person involved in the interview, I like those multiple people to complete the scorecard independently. I usually like a score of 1 to 5, 5 being great, 1 being terrible. And I just like that as a first initial response to see how everybody's thinking about the candidate.
Now, how many people are best in an interview process?
I don't think people do this well. I think they all need coaching, and I think that's only because they don't normally do it, right? People don't hire all the time.
Yeah.
So your customers, my customers, this isn't something they do all the time, and
Sure.
so they can use your help.
No, but are we talking about 2 to 3 interviewers? You have usually the hiring managers included,
right?
and then maybe two or
Maybe
three
a couple
other
of panelists.
people? Yeah.
It depends on the position,
Okay.
right? If it's an individual contributor, usually it's one hiring manager. If it's a leadership position, there may be more people involved,
Yeah,
depending on
absolutely.
the position.
Yeah, leadership, but just your basic everyday like senior person that you're trying to hire on board.
Mm-hmm.
You need at least, in my opinion, at least 3 to 5 people who are talking to that person and gathering the various information, the behavioral questions, right?
Yep.
I had an interesting, I've talked about this on the show a couple times before, but I interviewed at Amazon a few years ago, and they actually asked the questions based on their leadership principles.
Ah.
So their leadership principles, they'll run you through behavioral questions, but they gauge you based on whether or not you fit those principles, which is really interesting.
I think it gets to their value system.
Yep.
I think that's great.
Yeah, and if you both hold the same values, it makes for a good hire.
And by the way, so I think that those questions should be common to all positions.
Yeah.
Right? So you might, and in fact, this is what we would like to see, a set of behavioral questions that are unique to that position,
Mhm.
and then common questions that are common to the organization regardless of the position.
Got it.
Right? That sounds like that's what Amazon was doing.
Yeah.
Right?
You know what I like to do too is I like to build in a knockout question, usually within either the first or the second person, right?
Ah.
So something that's really key
Like?
to the organization.
Yeah.
So a knockout question would be something that if the person answers completely off base, you kind of slowly wrap up the question and you dismiss the person.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because
that's really
it saves the time of the other interviewers that are on the
that's
process.
a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a great solution to. And it's really compassionate, right? You're not taking everybody's time.
No, you wrap it up and you say, hey, look at it, based on our conversation, and I don't think you're going to be a fit, and you just kind of you let them out nicely.
Yeah.
You just kind of, and sometimes you can let them lead to that conclusion as well.
Yeah.
The interviewees.
Yeah.
So.
And at the end of the day, if it's not going to be a good place for them,
Yeah.
they wouldn't want to work there.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Not going to be a good fit.
Yeah, and when we talked about alleviating the pressure in the beginning, you also have to be congruent with whatever your environment is. If you have a really high stress, fast-paced environment and you're trying to alleviate the pressure, it may not be the best thing for the interview. I mean, maybe you need to add pressure on just to see how they handle it.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, the behavioral questions, give me an example of a really strong behavioral question that I think, that you like to have your clients ask.
Well, I'll say, so this one, it centers around business acumen.
Okay.
Describe a decision you had to make to protect the profitability of the company.
Okay.
So I'll stop there and let them answer that. Then, depending on how they answer it, I might probe deeper. What were the implications of the decision? Then, depending on how they handle that, how did you develop your strategy? Again, this depends on how they answer.
Sure.
How did you feel about the strategy that you developed? That's kind of an outcome question.
Sure.
What were the shortcomings and the successes? And so, again, this is sort of how their answer progresses.
Yeah.
Now, in their answer, they could give us all kinds of information that answer other behavioral questions that are on my list.
Oh, absolutely.
Right?
Yeah.
So they could talk about problem solving. They could talk about change management. They could talk about other things that are really important to me in my, on my agenda.
Yeah.
So
and it's always important to pick up on those things and explore those too as you're going.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't go on to the next question, guys, just because it's the next question on your list. Explore.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so as they begin to dive into one, we always ask, well, tell us a little bit more about that.
Yep.
And as you know this, I mean, you do this all the time, right? It's like peeling back an onion.
Oh, yeah.
We just love to learn stories. And if you're there just to learn stories and to gain more information, that's really where the gold is.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So
figuring out whether or not somebody's really good or a solid performer is exciting.
Yeah.
Because they may not have the skills that you're looking for, but you've got somebody who excels and does well and is going to perform well.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of hiring managers miss that.
Yeah.
Because they focus so much on the skills.
Right. And by the way, what we know is from all the data is that the people that fail in their positions, the failure rate because of a lack of competency is really small.
Yeah.
And so it's got more to do with the failure rate in areas of culture fit or emotional intelligence or coachability. Those are much greater.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So this probing in other areas is much more important, I think.
Yeah, probing and then kind of testing those answers too. I think would be another step to take it further, right?
Yes, yeah.
So, all right, so we get to the point where we've run somebody through the interview process. How do we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm always interested in their questions.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's where you're going, but I always want to find, it's always important to me what they're interested in, what their questions are.
Yeah.
And so I actually, I don't want to say midway through, but I take a pause 3/4 of the way through, 2/3 of the way through, and I ask the candidate, or I tell the candidate, look, we've been asking lots of questions. Why don't we pause here and give you an opportunity to ask us questions?
Yeah.
And that usually, what I really want in the interview process is I want an open dialogue, and I want to facilitate that open dialogue. So if I'm facilitating the interview for the client, then create this, and they start asking questions. And if what erupts in that moment is this back and forth open dialogue where the client or the hiring managers, the interviewers, and the interviewee get into this just robust dialogue, and there's real engagement there, then doesn't matter how it turns out, if that's the end candidate or not, I know that what I've landed on is good, because I'm learning in that process, by the way, and oftentimes the hiring managers are learning as well from this candidate.
Oh, absolutely.
They may in fact start learning some additional things about what they want and don't want from that candidate.
Absolutely.
Right? Because
and vice versa, the candidate might learn that as they're talking through it may not be the right fit for them.
That's absolutely right.
Yeah.
And I think that's gold.
So,
So
there's nothing worse than taking somebody down the path to an offer when all they're doing is just shopping your offer.
Right.
We're here to get people into the right roles, not to build ego.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. It's about careers.
Exactly.
So if we miss that mark, we've not done our job.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think.
I mean, it's from a candidate perspective, it's nice to say I got 7 offers. So but
it does your ego good, but
exactly, it doesn't help their career at all.
Right.
And a lot of times those are the people who end up going with the most money anyway. So then it puts you in that situation as well.
Right.
So now we've effectively wrapped up. We've got this person. We've gone through the whole questioning. How do we end it?
Oh wow. So am I going to get this question wrong?
I know there's no wrong answer,
yeah.
right?
So I always wrap up with reviewing where we've been.
Yeah.
I always make sure that everybody's asked all the questions they want. I make sure when I'm facilitating with the client, my client,
Yeah.
and with the candidates, I make sure that everybody's satisfied. They've asked all their questions, and if there's been a facility tour involved, then I make we've done that.
Sure.
And then I promise that I'm going to provide feedback to the candidate, and
So you set a timeline.
yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
That's
Sorry,
important.
was that the right answer?
Yeah, you got it. Ding, 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 ding. I think the only other thing that I do, because I do the same thing, the only other thing that I do besides setting the timeline is I try to connect the dots at the end. Before that person leaves, I want to make sure that I connect the dots of what their desires are and what the company has, and how I can get them either more engaged in it if it's the right thing, or disengaged if it's not.
A conclusion right there on the spot.
Not necessarily a conclusion, but just make sure that they leave it feeling, okay, well, here's where they check off all the boxes for me, and
yeah.
here's how I check off all the boxes for them, and vice versa.
Got it.
Now, one big last thing, ghosting. Get feedback back to people.
Oh, absolutely.
You have to close the loop.
Yeah.
There's so many articles going around right now, especially in our job market, of companies just going
silent.
Yeah. Ghosting.
Terrible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a terrible, terrible thing to do. So then,
inhumane.
yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
So very true. So I'm getting we got to wind up here, but one last thing, you were talking about reference checking.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
So let's summarize that, because that's very important, and that's just something that a lot of companies don't do.
Yeah, so a couple things about that. One, every candidate along the way, I think we learn from them. We pick up some yellow flags.
Yep.
And so we should be mindful of those. And I like to say that with those yellow flags, when we're doing the reference checking, I like to, as a bit of tradecraft, turn those yellow flags into an assumptive position with that reference. So, for example, if we think the candidate has a problem maybe with conflict resolution, so we might, with the reference, say, hey, I've noticed that Bob, our candidate, I noticed Bob has a difficulty with conflict resolution. We don't ask the reference, does Bob have a problem with conflict resolution? We assume that Bob does have a problem with conflict resolution. And we leave it to the reference to either correct us, oh, no, Bob doesn't have any problem with conflict resolution. Or we then let the reference say, yeah, as a matter of fact, Bob does have a problem with that, and here's how we handled it. So that's a little bit of a tradecraft approach. The other question that I love to ask every reference is, I say, hey, what gift would you give Bob to help his career?
There you go.
So I just do that,
I like that
as a habit.
And just an add-on to that, I know I got to wrap up here, but you can also use those references as referrals, guys.
Absolutely.
All right. So we're out of time, a little bit over for today's show. Scott, thanks so much for your time investment today.
Thanks for having me.
And welcome to the Higher Power Radio community.
Great to be here.
Now, if anybody's interested in working with you, I'm sure that there's going to be people out there. How do they reach you?
Well, you can call me directly at our
What's
website. So
whatever works for you.
Okay, the website is amtec.us.com, and my phone number 714-986-5500.
Awesome. Okay. Now, I want to thank our listening audience for tuning in to this week's episode of Higher Power. A quick thanks to our team, our engineer, Paul Roberts, our producers, Andrea Ballin, Shanti Ryle, and Kim Iverson. So listen to this show and any past episodes. You can check us out at Higher, that's H-I-R-E, powerradio.com, or Higher Power Radio on iTunes. Follow us on LinkedIn and Facebook at Higher Power Radio Show, or you can follow me on Instagram at RickGerard1. We have another great show lined up for you guys next week. Our guest is going to be Deborah Cantor, the president of Cantor Sales Associates. I'm your host, Rick Gerard, and you have been listening to the Higher Power Radio Show. Aloha.
Thank you for listening to Higher Power with Rick Gerard on OC Talk Radio.